Good afternoon, everyone. We'll call this July 31st meeting of the Planning and Environment Committee to order. I'll look to my colleagues for disclosures of pecuniary interest. Seeing none, we can move on to consent items. Any colleagues want anything pulled? Councillor Turner?
Just with respect to number 4 and 5, I think they're kind of intertwined. So just had
4 and 5?
a question as to those.
Sure. Anything else, colleagues? Okay, seeing none, we can take a motion on the balance. Councillor Helmer.
A couple of comments. I'm in line with the recommendation, so there's no reason to pull them, but a couple of comments. Glad to see that we prevailed at the Ontario Municipal Board with respect to item number 3. I know that was a recommendation coming from this committee and upheld at council. There's slightly too much intensification being proposed, and I'm glad to see that they will be agreed with us. On item number 7, I think it's helpful to have these reports in terms of the strategic plan and how we're doing in terms of timeliness and completion of those things. One piece that I wanted to emphasize, I mentioned this at a couple of other committees, is this sort of column where you have implications. And I want to use the first one as an example. So the planting strategy. Originally, we wanted to have this done sometime in April 2017. It's not on time. And one of the implications of something like a planting strategy not being on time is perhaps we're not planting the same things we would be planting if the planting strategy was complete, right? And so I think in the implications section, I'm more interested in not sort of like what's the revised timeline, but what is the impact of being delayed from April? And sometimes the impact is nothing, you know, like there's not really a big impact. Other times the impact is quite significant. We miss an entire planting cycle in the spring, and so, you know, that definitely cannot be planted according to the planting strategy. We also may miss one in the fall, and so I think that's the kind of information that I think would be helpful there in terms of understanding it. Obviously, there's a lot of items in this report, but we can see very clearly, and I think it's helpful to have this report, that so many of them are keyed on the London Plan and the appeals to that, so.
Thank you, Councillor. Anything further? Okay, seeing nothing, we can call the vote.
Councillor Van Holst said yes.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Just to anyone who's watching or in the gallery who might be a little confused, Councillor Van Holst typically doesn't sit on this committee, but he is acting mayor today, so that's why he's voting in ex officio capacity. Okay, and on to item number 4, Councillor Turner, you had that pulled.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question more with relation to item 5. And in the Appendix B, it lays out the, or Schedule B lays out the costs associated with the development charges, funded servicing costs, and the capital works budget. I think I understand, but I just wanted to seek clarification. In Wickerson Road itself, and all the redevelopment for Wickerson is predominantly out of need to support development along that stretch. What portion of that work is DC funded versus our tax levy funded?
Well, thank you through the chair. For Wickerson Road, the project that's identified here is actually not growth funded. It's a secondary collector road, so it is a local road. It's related to the realignment of Wickerson Road to correct a design deficiency at this time.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. So in this circumstance, then, despite all the development pressures on that road to support the development, there's really no purpose for that road now other than a couple of farmhouses and significant subdivision development that's going on there. This is still borne by the capital levy. Okay, thank you.
So could we take a motion on 4 and 5? Councillor Van Holst, if you could indicate your vote. Yay?
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you, colleagues. So our PPMs don't start until 4:30, and we have a couple of items we could deal with. But firstly, I'd like to really acknowledge Mr. McLean, recognizing that this is his last Planning and Environment Committee meeting. Mr. McLean's been here for 33 years at the City of London. He started in housing as the first planner dealing with housing, community improvement, and heritage issues. So I'm guessing you've seen a lot of change in the time that first began, Mr. McLean. A lot of your colleagues had a lot of positive things to say, noting that you're one of the funniest people that they've ever met, and they're really going to miss you in that capacity because you kept the workplace jovial and professional, and you're going to be greatly missed. Other comments where you would at the drop of a hat, you would help staff, citizens, or anybody who came across your desk asking for a moment of your time. So on behalf of this committee and ultimately council, thank you for your 33 years of dedicated service to making our city what it is today. Thank you. Alrighty, colleagues, so on to agenda item, number 12, a councillor submission from Councillor Zafman and Helmer. So I will look to Councillor Zafman as a guest if he would like to speak first, or then over to Helmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As a guest of this committee, appreciate you hearing this item. We'll see how much debate or discussion there is. Frankly, this was just, I think, Councillor Helmer's and myself's idea to try and be prepared when cannabis legalization comes in next year, as the federal government has stated with their Bill C-45. And really just wanting to get this in the hands of our planning staff so that they can have the time needed to make sure that when this does come into effect, our community has the preparedness to be able to deal with it.
Councillor Helmer?
I think Councillor Zafman covered it very well.
All right, Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, if I could just add a comment to that. I want to thank Councillor Helmer and Councillor Zafman for bringing this forward. It makes sense to be prepared. I do have, one of the concerns I have is the downloading to municipalities from a budgeting perspective, and how that is going to put extra pressure on our budgeting process. So I'm not exactly sure how we move forward. Obviously, we have to prepare, we have to figure out what we'll be doing as a municipality, but my other concern as well would be the budgeting implications. So as we move forward, I hope we're keeping that in mind, who is going to be paying and for that, and how do we approach the province or the federal government for extra funding. Not sure how that's going to work, but I think it's important to have as part of the conversation.
Your Councillor, do you want to comment from staff on the points that you've raised at this point?
Yes, please.
Yes. Anybody on staff willing to take a crack at that? Mr. Thomas Inzik?
Madam Chair, we've reviewed the letter and we agree with its content. In fact, we've already started reviewing this. It's on our work table for the next 18 to 24 months. So we've already got a head start on that. We think this is a prudent thing to do.
Thank you. Anything further, Councillor Hopkins?
Again, just emphasizing the budget implications. I think it's important that we be aware of them as well.
Thank you. Got Councillor Van Holst, then Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's great that we're thinking ahead. I would prefer we did not have to do the work, because I think it represents a great deal of duplicated efforts. If every municipality has to have their planning department look and do research on what's being done in other jurisdictions, then there's a lot of time wasted. And I think this happens a lot in government, whereas was said something's downloaded. So the implications of a decision mean a lot more work for levels of government down the pipe, or businesses as well, where they've got to do a lot of work that could easily be done by a higher level of government. So I think we should also ask them to do the work that we would be anticipating that will need to be repeated for other municipalities.
Thank you. Councillor Turner? Okay, that's the end of my speakers list, unless anybody else would like to speak. Okay, seeing none, we can call the question. Oh, we'll need it moved and seconded first. Thank you, Councillor Helmer and Turner. We can call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. And on to the deferred matters list, item number 13. Any speakers on that? Or would staff like to make comment? Councillor, Mr. Yanchula.
I'd just like to make note that on page 288 of your agenda, row number 9 at the bottom there, this is inaccurate. We didn't take it to the April 24th PEC meeting. We're expecting that the report on the redevelopment of vacant lots in London's downtown and its relationship to the upcoming downtown parking strategy will be coming forth in the fall, perhaps as soon as September.
Councillor Helmer.
I just wanted to know that it looks like file number 11 can be removed. We dealt with that at our last planning meeting and at the last council meeting, right? 942 is related to secondary dwelling units.
Shall we make that amendment then?
I had a question about the file number 5. This is a request we made back in 2015 about the Committee of Adjustment reporting. And it says that there's, you know, targeting May 2017, and now here we are in August 2017. So I just wonder if there's an update on that front.
Through the chair, unfortunately, I don't have an update for you at this time, Councillor. There's several here that are development service related matters. We're going to be reviewing those timelines. Due to the transition, I think we've got a few delays that we're experiencing, and we'll be coming back with revised dates.
Any further speakers on the deferred matters list, noting that we have 16 minutes until our next PPM? Quiet bunch today. Councillor Cassidy, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have just a quick question on item number 3 on the deferred matters list. The types of species able to plant on Boulevard. And I think there was a media report recently and they kept using the term invasive species. And I wonder if we differentiate at the city here, especially with regard to trees, if we differentiate between invasive species and non-native species, because obviously they don't, a non-native species might not necessarily be invasive as in choking out other native plants. So I wonder if when we're doing boulevard tree planting specifically, if we take that into consideration, and that's why we have certain species that aren't necessarily native.
Ms. Spence, would you like to make comment on that?
Through the chair, could you repeat the question? I know it was about invasive species.
Thanks. Yes, I'm just wondering, especially when we're doing our boulevard tree planting, do we differentiate between something that's simply non-native and something that's actually invasive? Because just because it's a non-native species of tree doesn't necessarily make it an invasive species.
Through the chair, you're correct. We do have a recommended tree planting list that hasn't been updated for some time. And I think about a quarter of the trees on that list are non-native. And like you said, just because they're not native doesn't mean they're invasive. Invasive normally applies to their habit, that they can either reproduce really quickly, become a problem in our ecosystems, things like that. But right now, what we do for tree planting, and in particular, Norway maples are a tree of concern. We do not plant those unless there's a real desire by a resident or a homeowner to have that type of tree, and the location is extremely challenging to plant in.
Okay, seeing no further speakers, we can take a motion on that. Thank you, Councillor Cassidy and Helmer. We'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
And colleagues, we can take a motion for a recess until 4:30 as we've dispensed with all the other untimed issues. Moved by Acting Mayor Van Hulst, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. All in favor? Okay, we'll see you back at 4:30.
My dad was a fireman.
Alrighty, we'll call the meeting back to order, recognizing that we have items number 9 and 10, which are interrelated. I've had a request from some members of committee and also from staff to deal with 10 first and then jump back to deal with number 9. Is there amenability to that, Councillor Turner?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess in here I would look for advice on the best way to proceed, given that the application for a building and an application for demolition, the order of operations is such that I'd want to make sure we get this appropriate.
Mr. Yanchula?
In terms of hearing the presentations, I don't think there's an issue one way or the other. If you want to vote on them after you've heard the entire thing, that would be up to you in my estimation.
Through you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Yanchula. So that might be the recommended course, is that we hear number 9, hold decision and pending the hearing of number 10, and then deal with the recommendations together.
All right, so we'll take a motion to open the PPM on number 9. Councillor Turner?
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0. Okay.
Ms. Dent?
Yes.
Mr. Yanchula, then Dent.
So, thank you. So I just want to make sure that it was noticed that there's a revised recommendation for number 9, which removes the prior clause B, and we can speak to that after you get a sense of the application that's before you.
Okay, thank you. Through the chair. This is a request for demolition for heritage designated property at 150 Dundas Street and 153 Carling Street. There we go. The building of the subject demolition application is a through lot property with frontage on the north side of Dundas Street and the south side of Carling Street. It is located between Richmond Street and Talbot Street. The existing building is commercial in use, and it occupies the whole property, which you can see. Oh, I guess I can't point here, but it's where the pointer is here, from 153 on one side to 150 on the other side. A couple street views, 150 Dundas Street, to give you some reference. The street view at 153 Carling Street. Heritage status of the properties, of the property, the two addresses are located in the Downtown Heritage Conservation District, designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act. It's a C ranking property. The properties are integral and contributing to the broader urban fabric. Properties adjacent to the subject building demolition site are mid-rise, so this is the context, and designated as part of the Heritage Conservation District. There's surface parking to the north on Carling Street, and many of the adjacent properties in and around the subject site retain some historical significance and importance to the streetscape. Several have landmark status. Historical background. Historically, this property has been a commercial site dedicated to the sale of clothing and dry goods. The current building dates from 1948 and was the former SS Kresge store up until the 1970s. The building is 2 to 3 stories in height, measures 80 by 180 feet, as I mentioned, covering the entire site, with access off the rear off of Carling Street. A bit about the style of the building is in the Art Moderne styled. Some of the attributes that are part of this style is an unadorned flat facade. 7 sets of windows are sunken into the facade. The windows are flanked by expressed panels, and there's an expansive upper cornice and lower signboard area below. The property retains importance as a placeholder within the downtown commercial fabric. However, the subtlety of detailing inherent in the modern style has been lost due mainly to excessive parging of the facade. So there's a lot of kind of panel detailing and lines that are no longer visible because of the parging. Demolition request under the Ontario Heritage Act, no owner of a property within a designated heritage conservation district is permitted to demolish the property unless a permit is obtained from the municipality to do so. Municipal council may give the applicant the permit applied for, notice that council is refusing the application for the permit, or permit applied for with terms and conditions. This request was received on June 7th this year. Some pertinent planning policies. Provincial policy statement directs that significant built heritage resources and significant cultural heritage landscape shall be conserved. So to conserve may be achieved through mitigative measures and alternative development approaches. So mitigative methods are identified in the Ontario Heritage Toolkit as alternative development approaches, design that harmonizes massing, setback, setting, and materials, and compatible infill additions. In the Downtown Heritage Conservation District, obviously the goal of a Heritage Conservation District is to preserve and to protect the heritage assets within the short term and long term. Demolition of buildings within a district is strongly discouraged. However, it is recognized that there are situations where demolition may be necessary, such as destruction due to fire or other catastrophic events, severe structural instability, and occasionally, and this is the case in this application request, when development is in keeping with appropriate city policies. A bit about reference to official plan and London plan. Within the Heritage Conservation Districts, the design of new development should complement the prevailing character of the area, encourages new development to be sensitive to and in harmony with the city's heritage resources. London plan requires that owner undertake mitigative measures. And the objective of the plan is to ensure that new development and public works are undertaken to enhance and be sensitive to cultural heritage resources. So city planning policies that back the approach being taken here. Some city policies, the strategic plan, London's community economic roadmap, our move forward. All of these support investment and development within the downtown, and also understand that heritage is important to that as well. The proposed project is for a 27-story mixed-use building, ground floor commercial space, second floor residential amenity space, and student residential units on the 3rd floor and up. Latch was consulted and commented on the original proposed project and provided the following suggestions. They wanted to see more first-story articulation, transparency of the first floor glazing, pedestrian-friendly scale. They wanted to see significant design characteristics that would give the design of this building some more prominence because of its location. And they wanted to see the podium setback to 5 meters, which in this original proposed project concept was at 3 meters. The Heritage Conservation District Plan sets at 5 meters for the podium setback. Proposed project and how it responds to the Heritage Conservation District guidelines is there was a chart that was provided in the staff report, and some of the things, some of the attributes that the proposed project meets are attributes such as a lower facade is at 5 stories. The base of the building is clearly articulated and pedestrian enhanced, lessening the perceived impact of the building height at the street level. Fine-grained detailing of the proposed development can be seen in Art Deco-inspired ornamentation and canopy. The roof cap is articulated. The use of colored panels add interest at the pedestrian level. So all of these responses in the design being proposed align with the Heritage Conservation District guidelines. Here's another view of the proposed project. The applicant had submitted at the last month's latch some concepts for details, so you can sort of see the quality and the level of detail that is being thought of for things like this back door for back entrance to the property, and the amount of detailing that is being proposed to match the Art Deco design. So demolition of buildings within heritage conservation is strongly discouraged, but each demolition request by staff is considered on a case-by-case basis. In some situations, the careful removal of select fragments when the urban fabric may be justified, for instance, redevelopment that is inappropriate and is in keeping with city policies. This approach is clearly supported in the city plans and policies mentioned here. The subject property does not demonstrate cultural heritage value or interest and does not significantly contribute to the heritage character of the district. Its form, massing, and appropriate expression at the street, and its architectural details that contribute to the district character. So it's the massing and the form at the street and not its architectural details of the current property that contribute. Little remains of the architectural significance of 150 Dundas and 150 Carling Street, with the subtle detailing inherent in the modern style being lost due to parging. Impacts of demolition on adjacent significant heritage resources is adequately addressed through mitigative measures targeted at ensuring compatibility of infill development with a design that harmonizes massing, setbacks, setting, and materials. Based on review of the heritage impact statement that was submitted by the applicant and further analysis of relevant policies, heritage staff is satisfied that there will be no adverse impacts to adjacent heritage designated properties and to urban fabric within the downtown heritage conservation district as the result of the requested demolition and proposed new development. Staff recommendation is that the proposed development concept outlined in the appendix to the Heritage Impact Statement be endorsed in principle and details to be refined and be submitted as part of a complete heritage alteration permit application with approval authority delegated to the city planner. That the applicant be required to post a bond or provide a certificate of insurance as a guarantee that adjacent buildings will be protected during demolition and construction. And finally, prior to any demolition, photo documentation of the exterior details of the existing building be completed by the applicant and submitted to planning services. Thank you.
Mr. Yanchula, you wanted to speak to the change in the recommendation?
Yes, I just wanted to let you know that we had received some advice from our colleagues in the legal services area, and we were, out of an abundance of caution, I think, proposing to have demolition, Clause B, which read, demolition be permitted after issuance of a building permit by the chief building official. But the that's really redundant to Part A, because what we were trying to do with Part B is say that we would have to have an approval of a construction ahead of time before the actual demolition could be commenced with. And so when we get a submission and we do the heritage alteration permit, we'll go back to council and approve the permit, and then, and not until then, would, under the Heritage Act, we'd be able to issue a demolition, the demolition permit could therefore be issued because we'd have been done with the Heritage Act. I hope that's clear. So it's a 3-part, not a 4-part recommendation.
Thank you. Any technical questions of staff at this time? Okay. Seeing none, would the applicant like to speak?
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, my name is Casey Golchicki. I'm a planner with Zelenka Preamble Limited, representing Rygar's property. I just want to take a moment to thank Laura for working with us through this application for demolition. We look forward to moving forward with this project, and we're on hand if you have any questions regarding the development. Thank you.
Any questions at this time? Okay. Seeing none, we can go to members of the public. If you'd like to speak on this application, you can come down to the microphone and state your name and address, please. Okay. Any comments on the demolition request for 150 Dundas Street and 153 Carling Street? Oh, Ms. Hutton, sorry, I didn't see you up there. The floor is yours.
Janet Hunton, 253 Huron Street. I would like to speak for the maintenance of a more human scale along the principal parts of Dundas and Richmond, near our main corner, still Dundas and Richmond. Something that pedestrians can enjoy. As I say, the human scale, maintaining a lower height restriction. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hutton. Any further comments? Okay, seeing none, we can take a motion to close the public participation meeting. Councillor Helmer.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Okay, colleagues, so at this time, we'll table this and move on to agenda item 10. Oh, Councillor Helmer?
Yeah, I don't agree with that approach. And I've always said that the issues around heritage designation and demolition are separate from the zoning matters that we're considering for the same properties. Sometimes people are going to support the demolition, but they don't support the zoning. Sometimes they don't support either. Sometimes they support both. And they're just two separate matters. I'd rather just deal with them separately. I think dealing with the heritage issue first is very appropriate and frankly don't even have to be dealt with at the same meeting. In my view, we could have dealt with this months ago in advance of the zoning application actually being dealt with. I know some colleagues really strongly prefer to deal with them both at the same time, as though the demolition and whether something should be demolished is contingent on, you know, what might be built there in the future. I don't take that view, and so I don't like dealing with them together. Obviously, if colleagues on the committee don't agree with that, we could vote on tabling it, and if that succeeds, I'll listen to the presentation.
Councillor Turner?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I respect my colleague's opinion on this. However, in this circumstance, the property is already designated. This question is ultimately just a question of the demolition itself, not necessarily in other circumstances where we've had to take a look at whether we designate it, then whether we permit the demolition, and then whether we permit the building separately. So the challenge here ultimately is if we were to move forward, stop here, after approving or not approving this request, if the request were to go forward and the subsequent component to this didn't happen, we'd approve a demolition, and then at that point, there wouldn't be anything else. And the risk of having a hole in the streetscape between Dundas and Carling would be present, and I'd prefer not to introduce that opportunity if we can. And I think this is one of those places where we do need to tie them together. Myself, I do agree. I think we should probably be designating well in advance on other files where we have those opportunities. So this has already achieved that designation. The question is ultimately one of demolition.
So colleagues, I'd like to deal with this by consensus. I'm looking to other committee members how you feel in terms of going forward with this. Councillor Hopkins?
I would prefer dealing with both of them. I think at the same time, a lot of my questions are sort of to both 9 and 10. Like Councillor Turner said, it's the heritage designation is already there, and keeping having a hole in the landscape is something that I have a bit of a concern. So I do think these two items should go hand in hand.
Okay, so Councillor, you'd like to deal with 9 and then 10, is that what I'm hearing? Okay. Okay, so we'll hear both PPMs and then go to the voting afterward. We're all set with that? Okay. So we will refer item number 9 till later in the meeting, and at this time we'll take a motion to open the PPM on agenda item 10.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-1.
Okay, Ms. Wise.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This application is for the same sites, 150 Dundas Street and 153 Carling Street. This is the proposed zoning bylaw amendment for the proposed development. In terms of some location context, the site is located within the downtown area, shown here in purple, and it is also located within the downtown shopping area precinct, which has a focus on ground floor, active ground floor retail and service facilities. The site is also located within the Downtown London Heritage Conservation District. Is also located on Dundas Street, which is undergoing the current proposal for flex space, known as My Dundas Place. And it also has proximity to the Forks of the Thames and the Back to the River initiative. Additionally, the site is also within the downtown BIA, CIP, subject to our Move Forward London's Downtown Plan, the Downtown Design Manual and Guidelines, as well as a number of other initiatives and policies. Some of this material has already been identified, so I'll try not to duplicate it. The site shown here has a frontage on Carling and Dundas Street of approximately 24.5 meters. The site area has 1,375 square meters, and proximity to local and nearby facilities such as the downtown library, Budweiser Gardens, Covent Garden Market, Victoria Park, and a number of other downtown notable uses. So this is the Dundas Street frontage, which we've seen, and the Carling Street frontage. The proposal is for a 27-story mixed-use apartment building with 600 square meters of ground floor commercial uses, 3-story podium, and 200 residential units. Shown here from the east, there's a mix of uses for this development, including vision and spandrel glass, precast concrete panels, as well as stone veneer. The west rendering, the building base is 1 story taller than the building to the west and is approximately 3 stories, which is fairly consistent with the building to the east. There's a main lobby off of the Dundas Street, and the same basic massing and articulation is also duplicated along Carling Street with the addition of a loading door. The building cap shown here has certain step backs on the top 3 levels and totally encompasses the mechanical equipment. Looking to our policy, the provincial policy statement promotes densities for new housing, which efficiently use land resources, infrastructure, and public service facilities, as well as supporting the use of active transportation and transit. The PPS also has direction to enhance the vitality and viability of downtowns and main streets, and also encourages a sense of place by promoting well-designed built form and cultural planning, and by conserving features that help define character, including built heritage resources and cultural heritage landscapes. So planning and urban regeneration have been working closely to ensure that this particular development does take into consideration the Downtown Heritage Conservation District requirements and is a compatible fit within this district. In terms of use, the downtown area permits a wide range of residential, retail, office, and commercial uses to enhance and maintain it as the multifunctional regional center for Southwestern Ontario. Street-level uses within this downtown shopping district shall be retail and service facilities to support a pedestrian-oriented shopping environment. So that's consistent with this proposal, which has active commercial uses on the ground floor. And also, our official plan encourages growth within the residential population of the downtown area. Looking towards intensity, the downtown is where the scale of development will be less restrictive. The downtown area is also distinguished from other areas by its intensive multifunctional land use pattern. The downtown area permits a height of up to 90 meters and a density of up to 350 units per hectare for this particular site. And the request is for a total of 85 meters and 1,498 units per hectare. In terms of form, the design of new developments is to have continuity and harmony of architectural style, with the precinct specifically. The design considerations for this proposal have included the Downtown London Heritage Conservation District, the Downtown Design Manual, our official plan, comments received from the Urban Design Peer Review Panel, as well as urban design colleagues. It's comprised of an architecturally differentiated base, middle, and top. The tower step back from the podium is one of the most critical parts to this. That will help to enhance the pedestrian environment on the ground floor and help minimize the massing of the tower as it is further off the street. In this case, there's also a 4th floor terrace proposed. This is the roof of the 3rd story. And this is an outdoor area available for the residents and also helps to activate the street, put eyes on the street as well. There's also a high proportion of vision and spandrel glass for this proposal, and a defined building cap, again, which conceals the mechanical penthouse and adds to the downtown skyline. So there were some options proposed for the loading door. This is the Carling Street frontage, and this is a functional loading door, but the design treatment has been enhanced. These are some of the options that have been proposed by the applicant and would be confirmed further through the site plan approval process. However, it shows the attention to detail and the screening of a rather functional space. So this particular site is located in a really prominent location of the downtown, close to the corner of Richmond and Dundas. This is directly on the doorstep of the My Dundas Place project. And this provides the opportunity for financial contribution or provision of a facility space to this project. The facility space could be storage for things like street furniture, and that sort of thing between events. So this is considered to be a bonusable feature and has been written in return for the greater density. Transportation and transit, as well as parking, has come up as a concern. The transit routes shown here are in orange. The transit stops are in the circles. So the subject site has access to a multitude of different LTC services currently, and is also one block south and north of the Rapid Transit Initiative through Shift. There's also regional connections through the Greyhound Station and Via Rail, which are within 400 meters of the subject site. So there's high connectivity for this particular site, as well as alternative options that can really only be found in the downtown for mobility. There's also bicycle storage proposed in the basement. So this will have a ramp out to Carling Street and eliminates the need for bicycle movement and elevators, which can sometimes be a deterrent, and provides convenient access to encourage cycling movements. The recommendation is for a downtown area special provision bonus zone. The bonus zone is to allow for the increase in density, that's 1498 units per hectare, in return for an enhanced built form, as well as the Dundas Place contribution or provision of facility space. The downtown area special provision includes a prohibition for any type of surface parking lot. This was intended to be a deterrent if there was a vacancy in terms of the building between demolition and rebuilding. No parking would be permitted on this particular site. Thank you.
Thank you. Any technical questions of staff at this time? Councillor Helmer?
A couple of questions about parking. Was the possibility of public parking to be provided underground discussed when we were talking about the bonusing?
Madam Chair, that comes up often in all bonus zones. In this particular case, there's no parking being provided at all, so it's difficult to provide a public parking lot on the site.
I recognize it might have been difficult, but was it discussed?
My memory seems to slip. There's so many right now in the queue, and I can't remember specifically, although I know it comes up often, but I'd hate to say yes, it was for this site and wasn't, and I just can't remember off the top of my head. I apologize.
I'm just going to move on to more questions because that's the part we're at. The ramp is suggested to come out onto Carling. This is the ramp for the bicycles, which will be used. Why is the ramp coming out onto Carling rather than coming onto Dundas?
Madam Chair, the Dundas Street frontage is high quality retail space, and so something would have to give. We'd have to give either retail space up on Dundas for the ramp to come to Dundas, or give up that retail space on Carling, and we opted to ensure the continuation of the retail space on Dundas and opted to have the ramp onto Carling.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons I'm asking the question, because what's proposed here is that the commercial will be on the back facing onto Carling, and then have the ramp also come out onto Carling, and then have the front onto Dundas just be the lobby space. So I'm thinking as a resident of the building, do I want to get my bike out onto Dundas or out onto Carling? And I'm not sure which is better. I think probably Dundas, but that's why I'm asking the question. I realize that it's going to have to interrupt something, either the lobby or the commercial space, to get access. My last question, I think, is in terms of the storage facility, how will access to that happen? Will that be through the lobby from Dundas into an elevator, or would it be out the ramp, out back onto Carling? If it's to serve Dundas Place, I want to make sure that it makes sense that, you know, anything that's coming in or out of that facility is not going out into Carling and then walking around the block.
Through you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to provide an additional comment, sorry. There is a ground floor lobby off of Dundas Street, but there are also commercial units that will have direct access to the street. It could be a number of them, it could be consolidated, but there definitely will be a commercial presence on that. That's the first part. The second is twofold in terms of the storage. If it works out, then the ramp could also be utilized in terms of moving items up and down. And one of the other things that we were looking at is ensuring that there's access to the larger elevators meant for the larger elevators anyways, to ensure that they are accessible for whatever needs to be stored down there. So if either of those proves unavailable, then we'd be looking for the financial contribution instead to use for alternative types of facilities on Dundas Place.
Okay, that's helpful. There's proposed to be 200 units. In some of the plans, it looks like they're all 2-bedroom units, is that correct?
Through you, Madam Chair, that's what's been proposed, yes.
Councillor Hopkins?
Thank you, and a question through you, Madam Chair, to staff, and I'd like to get back to the parking. I have a couple questions trying to understand how emergency vehicles and I guess what is required for emergency vehicles, as well as handicap if we have to provide parking.
Madam Chair, in the downtown, there are no parking requirements for residential development. And so that's as of right now, so it'd be difficult for us to compel someone to exceed that requirement when it's not permitted now. There is a requirement for commercial parking spaces. However, there's a bit of a formula to that. If you are adding commercial uses which exceed the existing parking standard, then you would have to make up that supply, although this doesn't apply in this case either. So there's no parking permitted. And I guess I'm looking for clarification though on the emergency services comment.
So emergency vehicles, do we have to allow for them, well, space for emergency vehicles with residential buildings?
Through you, Madam Chair, although the Ontario Building Code does require fire access routes for certain developments, in this particular case, we have Dundas Street and Carling, so there's no additional area for them to park, I guess, or stage.
Thank you for that. And I have one other quick question, getting back to the slides to staff. The LTC, the transit, I understand Dundas Flex City may not have a bus stops along Dundas Street, so I just want to verify that. I know from the slide it showed that there are stops right now, but in the future, as we move into Flex Street, will there be transit stops along Dundas?
Because of the Dundas Place project, there'd be no fixed transit routes between Wellington and the river on Dundas Place in the future.
Councillor Turner? Van Holsten Turner, I skipped you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, let me follow up a little bit with parking as well. We've got no requirement for parking for residential units downtown. When we created that bylaw, were we contemplating properties with 200 units in them? Is this still a good idea?
Madam Chair, at the time, it was done as an incentive to encourage development in the downtown, and so it was done to encourage high-rise development in the downtown. It has proven successful, although most high-rise developers do include parking because it's part of their marketability. Now, in this case, this applicant does not believe, given the proximity of this property to Fanshawe College, that will affect the marketability.
Okay, thank you. That's a good précis to my next question. So we're expecting many students to occupy this building. And what I would expect happen is that if there's a great number of students, many of them will try to move in within a 3-day slot. So how will we deal with that in this building?
Through you, Madam Chair. So the loading bay off of Carling Street, it has the roller door, so that would be able to accommodate a vehicle for movement, and also has access to elevators for that type of facility.
How many vehicles could we get in there? Is it just one at a time?
Through you, Madam Chair, just from the floor plans, I would suggest one. It would depend on the scale of it, certainly, but I do have access to the floor plan if you'd like to see how big it is.
Okay, at some point I might be interested to see that. It seems to me like you may have a little trouble getting students into the building on moving day, so that might be a challenge, or getting them out. That looks like it's going to be a challenge, but I'm happy to hear what staff says.
Madam Chair, it's probably worth having a subsequent discussion with the applicant, so to phase these sorts of, provide timelines for students to move in, and so that there's a schedule. However, we can't control that through zoning, but it's worth a conversation having with the applicant.
Thank you. I had one other question, just with respect to the residential DC grants. So how much would London be contributing to this for that case? It's downtown, so there's the grant for residential units.
Mr. Kokoris?
Through the chair, based on the 200 units comprised of 2 bedrooms each, we're looking at 3.7 million.
Okay, thank you. And if I may, just one final one, maybe address the idea of why just articulate why the 5 meter setback of the middle from the podium will enhance the human scale.
Yeah, Ms. O'Hagan?
Through you, Madam Chair. The step back above the podium is part of the requirements in the Heritage Conservation District. The purpose of that is to maintain a lower level for pedestrians on the street. So you would essentially not see most of the upper portions of the building. So you really retain that main street kind of feel at the 3 stories.
Thank you.
Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll reserve comments till later, but I did have a question that had respect to the east and west setbacks themselves. The design itself very aesthetic and has glazing all the way up, and of course it's going to be apartments in there. One of the things that we saw recently was with a hotel further down on Dundas Street that is having an apartment building built next to it, and the hotel was a little concerned because now their windows look directly onto an adjacent apartment building. Given that it's downtown and there's 0 side yard setback requirements, if there was an adjacent building built next to it and wanted to do 27 stories and wanted to do glazing, what would be the distance between the 2 facing aspects of the building? And is that contemplated for, or is it contemplated that this building stands on its own?
Through you, Madam Chair, the Ontario Building Code obviously contemplates spatial separation requirements between a building and its property line. A building can be placed directly at the property line with no unprotected openings. So if one chooses to have openings, there are other measures that would mitigate fire spread through perhaps a sprinkler deluge system, and that would come in as an alternative solution under the Ontario Building Code.
Thank you, Mr. Kokoris. Through you, Madam Chair. I guess specifically if a building wanted to build next to this one, and that component of the building code was satisfied. There's a bit of a setback. I think might be 5 meters on the east and west sides as well from the base of the building, from that podium itself. If another building were to be built next to it, then it would have presumably the same amount of setbacks. So the distance between facing windows would be about 10 meters or about 30 feet. So is this building contemplated to be on its own, or could somebody build a 27-story tower next to it with a 10-meter separation between windows?
Again, under the guise of the Ontario Building Code, basically, to put it in simple terms, the distance from the property line is proportionate to the percentage of unprotected windows that you have on that face and that elevation. So if you don't want to do take any mitigating measures, you'd have to have an increased setback from the property line. As far as building permits go, the chief building official who's here tonight would turn his mind to the setback from the building to the property line and not necessarily what types of buildings are located on adjacent properties.
Through the chair. So basically, we would be looking at the building permit for this property in the current state, and a future building, if it were to develop next door and go up to a certain level or higher, they would have to take mitigating measures to ensure that the life safety requirements of that building meet the building code. So they may have to take additional measures to fire rate the walls or put shutters or whatever that, fire shutters or whatever that may be, to ensure that they meet the spatial separation requirements of that building in the future.
Okay, thanks. Ultimately, the question kind of speaks to just comfort, recognizing that the building code itself is what it is, right? And it speaks to the fire code and the fire separations and all of that. And just the way we've built downtown, it allows for the objections that we heard from the previous tenant on a previous file was that it's so close, and there's nothing really that would provide for separations. They could build as long as they met the building code piece. And so presumably 5 meters and 5 meters would be 10-meter separations between windows if that went up. So, okay, and that's my only concern there. So I appreciate the answers, thanks.
Any other technical questions? Seeing none, we can go to members of the public. If you'd like to speak on this file, come up to the microphone and state your name and address, please. Any comments on the file at hand regarding 150 Dundas and 153 Carling Street? Yes. Come on down and state your name and address, please.
Okay, it is Kelly McKeating. I live at 329 Victoria Street, and I have been asked to speak on behalf of Mike Bloxham, the president of the Architectural Conservancy Ontario's London Region branch. And I just want to reiterate the written comments that the ACO made. In making your decisions, we encourage you and then City Council to adhere to both the spirit and the letter of the London Plan, even though it is not yet in full effect. We do understand that under the London Plan, buildings of 20 to 30 stories are permitted at this location, but it's also our understanding that the evaluation criteria for approval includes consideration of the impact on adjacent buildings in the context of a neighborhood. In our opinion, a 27-story building would have a detrimental impact on the context of the neighboring buildings and the vibrancy and viability of the Dundas Flex Street. The closest tall buildings to this site are at Dundas and Richmond, where there's a 6-story building and a 5-story building, with the Market Tower Clock Tower rising to approximately 7 stories. There's a striking contrast in height, as could be seen in the staff presentation. And we certainly feel that in the context of the livability of the downtown area and the desirability of Dundas Street as a pedestrian place, as a people place, that something more in the order of 10 to 12 stories would be appropriate. When you come to a building this tall, there's also the concern about depriving people of natural sunlight. And yes, it's on the north side of Dundas Street, but it does, just building above you instead of blue sky. It does deprive Dundas of light, and it will deprive people on the north side of the building from light as well. So we encourage you to consider that aspect in assessing the proposal. The design of the building, I have to say, really impresses me, and it's exciting to see such an attractive, thoughtful new building being considered in the downtown area. It's also nice to see the setback at the 3 and 4 story level, because that is important to having the building not be too imposing over the pedestrians. And those are all our comments.
Thank you, Ms. McKeating. Any other speakers? Going once? Going twice? Okay, seeing none, would the applicant like to speak? I'm sorry, I forgot to give you the opportunity earlier.
Through you, Madam Chair, kind of similar to my earlier comments, I just want to thank Sonia Weiss and Michael Tomlinson-Zick for working with us through this proposal. We look forward to moving it forward. We've read their staff report, and we are in full agreement with their recommendation as stated.
Any technical questions of the applicant at this time? Recognize we haven't closed the PPM yet, but we should probably do that first. Okay, Councillor Turner, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was reading through, and it talked about the usage of bike parking itself, that bike parking would be restricted to residents. Is there any opportunity for commercial usage of the bike parking for any of the employees that might work in the building, either in its retail spaces or in the building itself?
Through the detailed site plan stage, once we work with the city on storage facilities for Dundas Place, or potential storage facilities for Dundas Place, as well as the final bicycle parking areas, certainly if there is an excess of a number of bicycle parking areas, we could turn to an opportunity to allow for commercial use of those extra spaces if there's a significant number in excess of what's required for the residential portion.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. I guess specifically even just to the tenants themselves, the retail or commercial tenants of the building itself, it seems like that amenity would be helpful to have for them as well.
Any other technical questions? Councillor Helmer?
Related to the actual bike parking that's going to be provided, considering these are all proposed to be 2-bedroom units, do you think that the ratio for bike parking is going to be enough to accommodate the demand you might see from the people actually living in the building?
I just might start off through you, Madam Chair. So the requirement is based on our minimum standards for the zoning bylaw. That requires 0.75 parking spaces per unit, which is equivalent to 150 bicycle parking spaces for 200 units. So that's the minimum. Certainly if there's an increase in demand, that could be something considered, but meeting that addresses the fact that not everyone would have a bike, but some units may have more and that sort of thing.
I guess if I could rephrase my question for the applicant, I understand what the minimum requirement is, but do you have room on the lower level to do more than 150 bicycle parking spots, or are you really just planning for 150? Because it seems like it could be quite low. I've been in some buildings that have a lot of bicycle parking, either in the unit or underground in the storage area, and they tend to be very popular once they get going, especially given the marketing focus of the building. I could see it being very high demand for bicycles.
Through you, Madam Chair, we at this point, we know that we can accommodate the minimum 150 parking spaces, and through the bonusing discussions with City, with the potential for the Dundas Place storage facilities, we haven't sunk our teeth into a detailed design of the lower level yet to figure out how the layout would work, and so we know we can accommodate 150 minimum, but once we get into the detailed design, we could provide substantially more. We haven't worked out exactly what the final figure would be for that.
Councillor Hopkins?
Yes, quick question for you, Madam Chair. I think to the applicant, I was wondering if a student marketing analysis was done at all, or if you had considered the demand for students in the area.
We did not, as part of the application, we did not provide a marketing strategy. I cannot comment if the applicant had any marketing strategies done prior to the application being filed.
I have a quick question. So with this proposal, is there any appetite to align any sort of construction with the construction of Dundas Place going forward, just so it's a one-shot deal if this goes forward?
Yes, we've actually already held preliminary meetings with the Dundas Place team to determine timelines for the applicant and as well as the city for construction on Dundas Place, because it was through the meeting that we learned that the Dundas Place construction will be quite extensive, and it would be in everybody's best interest to dovetail these two projects together, and that is the goal we are working towards, is to have those two construction projects going on simultaneously.
Any further speakers? Okay, seeing none, we can take a motion to close the public participation meeting. Okay, moved and seconded, we can call a question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Okay, colleagues, we'll circle back to agenda item number 9, which deals with the demolition request for 150 and 153, pardon me, 150 Dundas Street and 153 Carling Street. Looking for speakers. Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The challenge here for me, I really appreciate the design, the aesthetic, what the intent is for this building. The challenge is ultimately what and how quickly the building will be put in its place. As described during the preamble to the report here, that the desire not to have a gap on the streetscape on Dundas Street is of paramount importance to us. And we have seen circumstances where an application for a building has brought forward, and an application for demolition of a heritage building has been brought forward as well. If I were to take the example of one on Queens Ave between Clarence and Richmond, that had a promise of a building being put in its place. The building comes down. It's years later, and it's a parking lot now. I appreciate the holding provision in there that's being proposed to state that it shall not be used for parking. That provides some comfort. Ultimately, the applicant here has two significant applications before us. One has been approved already and needs to move forward, and this one needs to move forward as well. Both of them would require significant sources of financing. And my concern is that the two buildings can't be built concurrently. And I want to seek some sort of assurances that they could. And I'm not quite sure how to do that. I'm not sure how to have that placed in either this or the other one. The other one's done. We've approved that, and it has to move forward. The risk is if we approve this one and this becomes the desire to move forward on, and the financing's in place for this building gets built, great. There's no gap in Dundas. However, we have a pretty big empty lot sitting on Talbot Street. So how do we get around that? I know that sometimes, well, that's a challenge with subdivisions in their own right, to be able to ensure that financing is present in order for that to be able to move forward. I was trying to see if there was any way of using holding provisions to ensure that financing is demonstrated in order to be able to achieve approvals, and that holding provision be removed at the time of that. I haven't seen it used that way. Is there any way that we could address this?
Mr. Kotsifis or Tomazinzik or Yanchula?
Through the chair, I guess in the context of a holding provision, we typically have not tied a demolition to a provision, notwithstanding that to say that you can't. That might be something maybe legal may weigh into in terms of the use of the zoning bylaw for that purpose. It could be problematic, but I can't say at this time because it's not something we've really typically done in the past.
I think what we also have to remind ourselves is we're here on this particular application, so we're making the land use decision here, and I appreciate the comments and understand why you're making them. And Councillor Turner?
And notwithstanding that, Madam Chair, and not to get into cross debate, but absolutely, we're talking about this application here, and as we do, as we're considering and contemplating a demolition application, we're considering that demolition application in the context of the subsequent application in number 10, which is for a building application. So we're considering the context of the core in general, and I think all of that stuff enters into the discussion and has to be weighed ultimately in how our development in the core progresses. I really would love to see this building move forward, so I'd just like to see how we can do so in such a way that doesn't jeopardize other projects within the core.
Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I think I got one more question for our staff. I know it's about the related sort of change in the recommendation. So the way I read these terms and conditions that are being recommended, and I'm glad to see that we're dealing with a heritage alteration permit of a designated building as a way of controlling and managing the demolition process. I know I've mentioned it many times at committee, and here's an example of where we're doing that. The heritage alteration permit would be granted before the building is modified, right? And so between the period of time where the building is being modified, i.e. being demolished, and when the next building is built, that could be a short period of time or it could be a long period of time. And the previous condition, part B, said the demolition will be permitted after there's going to be a building permit issued, which, you know, if you've come in for a building permit, you're all the way through site plan, you've done all your planning, the chief building officials actually reviewed all that stuff, you're very close to the point where you're going to be building. And so that has kind of its own limit on it. My concern with just having the heritage alteration permit as the only condition that's related is that's fine, it won't be granted until the city planner signs off on the heritage alteration permit, but then that period of time, the city planner has no idea how long that alteration period might be, and there might be a big gap between when that happens and when the building permit comes out. So I don't see them as being totally redundant. I think, in fact, the one that had the part B is a little bit more control over when the demolition would actually be permitted and how close it would be to when the building permit is issued. So that's my question, I guess, whether we're concerned about that potential gap between the alteration permit and the building permit.
So we were in conversation with our legal staff today around that, and the way that they've explained it is the B isn't, B was redundant, and the reason for that was that we're dealing with two different acts. We got the Ontario Heritage Act, which allows us only three choices in a condition like this: permit the what is applied for, refuse what it's applied for, or offer conditions. And so that the condition that we offered was intended to make sure that we had, as much as we can within the purview of the Heritage Act, a real proposal in front of us that will really get built. And the closest step that the Heritage Act allows us to do that is in an approved heritage alteration permit. So if we have doubt and you need a heritage alteration permit to do what you want to do, and you still do for this application, that was the best tool that we had. When we were invoking the the demolition permit, that's under the Building Code Act. And the problem with that is that the chief building official under the Building Code Act is compelled to issue a demolition permit or a construction permit if they meet the criteria that the Building Code Act provides for. So instead of confusing the issue with the Building Code Act, even though we were, trying to make the link, we actually have the tool in the Heritage Act, which this application is asked for under, to be able to do it as close as we can. But we can't compel anybody to build anything with whatever permission we give them. That's a conundrum in the Planning Act as well. We permit something to happen, but we can't compel something to happen. What we did, because none of us is looking for a missing tooth in the smile along Dundas Street, is to do what Mike's team has done, which is to at least say, if for some reason there is a gap, there isn't going to be a parking lot there, it will be a vacant site, and that's the best we could come up with the tools that the province provides us for under the Planning Act, the Heritage Act, and the Building Code Act.
Okay, I have another question about, I guess it's the new B. And this is about the bond certificate of insurance as a guarantee about the adjacent buildings. So do we have some sense of the magnitude of what that would be? Because certainly if the building is going to be demolished and then the bond is going to be held or the guarantee is going to be held for a long period of time and it's a significant amount of money, I think that has a tendency to want to make things go fast. I just wonder if you could speak to the order of magnitude of that bond.
So I can't specifically for that property, but we've had another property downtown where a certificate of insurance was provided for a $1 million liability. So if it is anything like that situation, that's our experience so far.
Okay, I was looking for reassurance and that's not really reassuring me. That's okay. Okay, and I understand you can't really speak to the specifics, but the carrying cost of an insurance policy like that is not actually that high. So, okay, on the actual recommendation, I support it. I think, you know, we've got a good recommendation from Latch about this building, the existing building. You know, it's a C-rated building. I think the parging has really taken away a lot of the important architectural details. I think the development concept that's being proposed to replace it, especially in terms of the massing and the form, how it presents on the Dundas Street is quite appropriate. I think it's a good replacement for what is there now. And I think once it's built, I think it would fit very well into the streetscape at the level of up to the podium. I'll talk about the height when we actually get to the actual zoning application, but I do think in terms of the recommendation around the demolition and the designated property, that this is an appropriate way to proceed with this building.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I also think this is a very appealing offering, and I'm comfortable with the heritage aspects about it. Certainly more so than the last application.
Thank you, Councillor Van Holst. Councillor Park.
Thank you. It's like the 7th inning stretch. So in terms of the demolition request, the first question I asked myself is, what is there now really contributing to the street fabric? Is it contributing in a positive way to the overall Heritage Conservation District? And I think the recommendation from Latch and our heritage planners and the rest of the city staff and Ms. Wise is, no, it doesn't. It doesn't in any way, shape, or form add to the streetscape in a positive way at this point. And the application that we'll deal with subsequent to this, I think, really will enhance the streetscape there. I appreciate a lot of the throwbacks to the Art Deco design and those sorts of things, but we'll talk about that later on. I think that Councillor Turner raised some questions that any person would ask, but I don't know that I would ask them at this point in time. I think that when hearing from staff and the applicant that good faith steps have been taken to talk about dovetailing the construction of the proposed project, and in line with Dundas Place, gives me hope that there certainly is an appetite to move forward with this in an expedient manner, knowing that the construction to my Dundas Place isn't too far away. So I'm supportive of the demolition request at this time, and I want to thank our heritage planners and Latch for the depth and breadth of the heritage impact statements that they've been doing for the last year, and especially on this file, that it really gives council good advice and good information moving forward. And it's also interesting to note what happens in buildings in our main streets in the downtown. So thank you. Any further speakers? Seeing none, we can call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Okay, colleagues, we'll now go to item number 10. I'm looking for speakers. Councillor Cassidy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to concur with some of the comments that have already been made, knowing that I expect my colleagues to elaborate because we were dealing with the demolition permit before. But I just want to also say that I think it's a really positive indication of where the downtown is going. And I know this has been a long-term endeavor over at least the last 10 years of revitalizing our downtown. But it's, you know, we have seen a specific focus on Dundas Street, specifically with the Flex Street and the Back to the River initiative. So I think seeing this kind of investment and how it goes hand in hand with the investment that Fanshawe College and the city, together with Fanshawe College, has put into the Kingsmill building. So I think it's positive. It's great news for our downtown. One of the big questions when Fanshawe College was moving forward with the addition to their downtown campus, one of the big questions was, where are all these students going to live? And we have somebody coming along and providing an answer to that question. As far as how timely the development will be, I have confidence that it's in the applicant's best interest to move this along quickly. I hope Councillor Turner's fears are unfounded. I hope that both developments will move forward and will move forward quickly. And I am in complete agreement with the staff recommendation.
Councillor Hopkins and Turner.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And it's exciting to support a building in the downtown core like this, revitalizing the downtown. And I appreciate the work that's gone into this. I hear the concerns, though, of the gap that may be there. I would encourage the developer that not be allowed. I don't know what more we could do as a committee, but I do think that it would be to the best interest of the applicant and to get this going as soon as possible and keeping our streetscape and the vitality of downtown. The whole idea of this building coming forward is to revitalize it, not step backwards. And so very, I support the recommendation, and obviously I appreciate Latch's comments on the demolition of the two buildings and supportive of the demolition. I do recall when I was campaigning in 2014 and the topic of Kingsmill and Fanshawe moving into the area, like Councillor Cassidy said, it was a conversation with Fanshawe coming into the downtown core that it would be supported with student housing, and this is a building that is going to do that, so I'll be supporting the recommendation.
Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'll give the quick comments at the beginning here. I think the design is fantastic. I really, it's funny because Art Deco is one of my favorite styles, and the examples of it in London are ones that I always turn to when I think about my favorite aspects of the city. I think generally for me a podium of 5 stories is a little high, but when I take a look at how it lines up with the rooftops along Dundas Street, it's consistent with that, and it provides that same scale. When I look at the mock-ups, actually the way the glazing acts looks like it really stretches it, but allows for that scale to not seem as daunting as intimidating. So I'm supportive of that. I'm supportive of aspects such as bicycle parking in lieu of car parking. I think these are, when we talk about our rapid transit connections and the aspects such as Dundas Place, these are the things that we're encouraging, and this is an example of what transit-oriented development would be. I do have some apprehensions, though, and the apprehension is really a question of how long that gap stays in the streetscape. We've seen situations where we've been asked to approve buildings, and as soon as the appeal period is elapsed, the building construction starts. And we've seen situations where we've been asked to approve buildings and demolitions have occurred, and it's been years and years and years and years. So I don't know where we fall on that. And I'd like, if I may, through you, Madam Chair, to seek legal advice on what mechanisms we might be able to use that we can appropriately stage development here.
Okay, so Mr. Belch just stepped out. We'll just wait for him to return.
Not too long.
While we wait, are there any other speakers? And then we can circle back to Councillor Turner. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much. I also think it's a great design. If I was a student, 15 years old, and in Ontario, and I saw this, I'd be looking for a roommate already, because this would be a great place to live. So close to school, with so many amenities around it, and a place to park my bike. I think we may need to look at, again, parking outside of this area for cars, people coming in here. For instance, we're considering parking near the 401 along the south BRT route. I know I lived in a building of this stature in Toronto. I was on the 33rd floor of the Hotel Plaza 2 at Yonge and Bloor, which is a great spot. And I didn't use my car. I kept it parked right at the 401. So if I needed to leave town, then I would do it. But that's where I kept the car. And I think people will be in town with cars and want them somewhere. That would be a place to do it. And I just offer to the applicants the thought about the logistics of getting students in there. Getting people into building can be a trouble. I was working on automation in a hotel in Dublin, and they had a little roundabout for dropping people off at this hotel, high-end hotel. They didn't design it big enough for a bus to turn around in, so it was some problems with afterthoughts there. So that's worth thinking. How are we going to get all these students in there in a few days? But I'm sure they will want to come. As you build this, they will come.
Councillor Turner, if you'd like to reiterate your question, Mr. Belch is here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Mr. Belch, thank you for joining us. My question surrounds the kind of the conundrum of how we help to facilitate quick and rapid development of the site after demolition. I think you've probably been aware of the concerns that the Planning Department and Development Services have had with respect to having a gap in the streetscape by permitting the demolition and then the potential for not having that development occur in due course. Understanding that there's a provision within this application that won't allow it to be used for parking, and that the sequence of events requires that a building permit be pulled prior to allowing the demolition. Are there other tools? And my concern ultimately is that the financing doesn't materialize for this site and that it's left without the ability to apply. And I don't know if there's the ability to use something like a holding provision, that the holding provision was contingent on financing or demonstration of sufficient financing to proceed, and so on and so forth. I'm not quite sure what mechanisms we might be able to use in that regard.
Question that we should go in camera for that.
Thank you, Mr. Belch. So then, Madam Chair, if I may request that we rise and sit in camera for the purposes of receiving legal advice to that effect.
Do we have a seconder for that? Councillor Hopkins? Okay, manual vote. Okay, we take a manual vote to go in camera to receive legal advice. Yay? Okay, the yeas have it. We'll return momentarily. We'll be in committee room 3. Okay, we'll call the meeting back to order. Councillor Turner, you still have the floor. Again.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for rising for in-camera advice. I appreciate that. I do have one more question. I guess it is ultimately it was addressed to some degree with the last item on number 9 with respect to the assurances for damage to adjacent properties. In the period between demolition and construction, these buildings, as we take a look at 183 King Street, for example, braces are required to hold that building up, and because the buildings beside it have been removed. What provisions would need to be in place in order to assure the structural integrity of the adjacent buildings, and not just insurance bonds, but also actual physical provisions?
Through the chair, in situations like this, when there are adjacent buildings involved, we ask for a professional engineer's report as to what measures will be taken to ensure the structural integrity of adjacent buildings is maintained during the demolition process.
Thank you.
Looking for further speakers? Councillor Helmer, then Van Holst.
So I support the zoning that's being recommended by our staff. I think it's quite appropriate in terms of the height. As my colleagues will recall, we dealt with an application back in May, I think it was, for 515 Richmond. That building was proposed to be 101 meters in height, and this one is about 19% shorter than that. And I think it's a good sign that we're having some taller buildings moving out closer to main streets like Richmond and Dundas. I think it's important that we get the podium part right so that the setbacks for the middle part of the building are appropriate, and we keep that sort of street level streetscape that we are trying to get on the street like Dundas and Richmond, while still adding an intensity and the height on top of that. So I do think that Councillor Van Holst raised a good point around like actual logistics of moving in and out of that building when there'd be peak demand that's very, very high. So it's 200 units, but they're all proposed to be 2 bedrooms. If there's only one loading place, that could be very logistically difficult. You can imagine if you were to try and do that all in one day, you would have a lot of movements happening, probably so many that it wouldn't possibly work. And even if you went over a couple of days, because oftentimes what happens in student residences, which anyone who's lived in a student residence knows, that people come with their own moving trucks. They don't come together on the same moving truck. So you have all kinds of movements in and out. For buildings that have their own surface parking, it's not really a huge problem. It can be inconvenient for the students, but it's not inconvenient for anyone else. Having a building with that many people in it, with no place to park other than the loading area for unloading, I think that actually is a very legitimate concern, and I'm not sure how that's going to be handled. I think it's part of the reason we're running into the density here is very, very high, right? We're talking almost 1,500 units per hectare. And I think that in combination with the kind of marketing that is being suggested to target at student renters and the kind of moving patterns that they have, that could be a problem. It might require, for example, allowing some kind of temporary street closure to allow for movements of students. And I don't know that we necessarily want to do that. The public streets are for everybody and not for one particular building, but I think we might have to consider something like that. Fortunately, immediately south of this building is Dundas Street, which is planned to be a flex street, which is going to be temporarily closed for various reasons. So maybe it's a good time to have a festival around the time that people are moving in and out. So I think there's ways to deal with that outside of the zoning, and I think the zoning is quite appropriate.
Thank you, Councillor Helmer. Acting Mayor Van Holst.
Thank you very much. Of course, another thing to consider is garbage upon moving out. I know there's parts in town, there's houses in town where there might be 6 to 8 students in a house, and when they move out, there's a great pile of junk in front of the house. But that's not 400 students, so that might prove to be a challenge as well. My question through staff, the amount of bonusing in terms of density is quite high. We're looking at 200 units. Without bonusing, how many units would this property have been?
Mr. Presiding Officer, we would have to do a little bit of quick math in our head, but just to let you know, the density right now as of right is 350 units per hectare, so we would just do that division in our head. It's, we're talking about maybe 1/6 of the overall. Do you have the numbers on you? I'll defer to my colleague.
Thank you. Well, they work
Okay,
on the
well,
math.
if I may, if somebody's punching that, I suppose I could do it well if it's just a linear calculation. But so my question is, that seems to be pretty substantial bonusing in terms of density. How did that match off against the bonusing that we got in terms of what characteristics of the building matched that amount of bonusing?
Mr. Presiding Officer, there's no set formula in our existing official plan. It's a dialogue with the applicant and also with the needs of this immediate area, recognizing the needs for Dundas Place that will be upcoming, and there's this can contribute financially to that. We felt that it was appropriate there. Also, typically one that's common is underground parking, and that's not available to this site as well. But having said that too, this is one of the few that's within the Heritage Conservation District, where some of the other ones in downtown weren't, and the design response to this context was outstanding, and so it warranted, in our opinion, that increase in density as well.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas-Ensik.
Thank you.
Mr. Van Hulst. Councillor Park.
Thank you. I'm in support of the application here, and I think that based on what we've seen to term, I think that this is one of the most thoughtful design pieces that we've seen, and I think that the bonusing here to really lock in that detail with the Art Deco throwback and ground floor design, and really hunkering down on having an active streetscape or active frontage on both sides of the building is quite important, considering how many other developments we've seen with underground parking where you get that dead space on the main street. So for those reasons, I'm in support. I really am a fan of the level of detail, especially with the perforated metal hangings at the back on Carling Street. I just think that that's just a really good contribution to the public realm there. I can't think of a better spot for a development like this with two Fanshawe campuses right on Dundas Street there with the Flex Street coming online. I think that there's all sorts of good contributions that this building could make in the future.
Thank you, Councillor Park.
Any further speakers? Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to weigh in on some of the concerns about the lack of parking and the limited loading zone area and all of that. And Councillor Van Hulst brought up the experience that we have driving up and down Richmond Street on the weekend in April when most of the students tend to move out. And I think the difference in those student housing units compared to this proposed building is that those are standalone homes without any kind of management on site. I expect that there would be a property manager on this site, and I expect that in these kinds of situations, as I know in high-rises in Toronto, in residential high-rises in Toronto, when people are moving in and out, they have to schedule an elevator. They have to get on a schedule somehow and book their move. So I suspect something similar would take place here as well. And I think the fact that the loading zone will be on Carling Street is a good thing as well, because it is a less busy street than Dundas. It seems to be less traveled, and that was historically the loading area for this building when it was a commercial building. So I think it fits well to continue to have that there. I think we're seeing with some of the newer residential student residences or student private residences that have gone up on Richmond Street further to the north, we're seeing some higher quality buildings purpose-built for students coming into the city. And I think that's a really good thing for a lot of the strain that we've seen in near campus neighborhoods. It's giving students more options. It's giving a better quality of student residence outside of what they've normally been used to in the city, which is not very well-maintained homes within a residential neighborhood. And that hasn't been good for many reasons and for many different parts of our city, and people in our city. So I think this is a really positive thing. I don't think we need to micromanage how everything is going to work. I think it will be, again, in the property owner's best interest that this is a really well-run building, that things like loading zones and bicycle parking and moving days are really well managed, because again, at the end of the day, this is a marketplace. And if the applicant, if the owner of the property wants students to choose this building, then they have to make sure that it is as well run as possible. And so I think that there are many, many positives for this. Everybody has touched on the aesthetics, so I don't need to go there because I agree with what everybody has said so far.
Any further speakers? Seeing none, we can call the question. Mr. Thomasinse.
Madam Chair, I have that answer. I have the answer. Assuming that there was still 600 square meters of commercial space on the ground floor, that would be the equivalent of 6 units, leaving 40 units for the remainder in residential form.
And with that, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Sorry about that. And with that, on to agenda item number 11, a public participation meeting regarding the application by the Corporation of the City of London to amend the zoning bylaw for group home type 1 uses with regards to distance separation regulations. I'll take a motion to open the PPM. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. We can call the question. Councillor Helmer?
Oops, sorry, that was my bad. Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Mr. Yeoman.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I do have a brief presentation for committee tonight. I'm pitch hitting for Mr. Pompilio, who's on vacation. What you have before you tonight is a city-initiated zoning bylaw amendment related to group homes. What we're asking for you tonight with the resolution is to remove regulations in the zoning bylaw for a 250-meter setback for group home type 1 uses. As well, we're asking for direction to initiate a policy and regulations review for group homes in general. This will obviously involve significant public input to that review as well. I think it's important tonight for a bit of context when we're talking about the two different types of group homes. We do make a distinction in the zoning bylaw, which is an important one to make. Type 1 uses are group homes that generally serve people with disabilities. They're directed to be located in neighborhood settings, and they really do provide integration within the community for its occupants. Generally, they're quite seamless within a neighborhood. Group home type 2, however, these are the ones that are more intensive. They're located within specific zones, such as a regional facility zone. They are not prohibited in low-density residential neighborhoods, and we're not recommending at this time any changes to the separation distances for those. I think it's important to note for committee that we've received information about potential legal challenges under the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms related to the separation distance for group home type 1s. There's been some concerns that have been raised about discriminatory provisions that are related to these regulations, and that's one of the reasons why we're here tonight. There have been similar challenges for several Ontario municipalities related to this as well, and they have followed this, this procedure where they're removing the separation distances like we are tonight. We really think that the recommended amendment will really mitigate some of these potential legal challenges. As well, we've received a lot of feedback, and this request has been initiated with group home operators as well for these group home type 1 uses. They really do believe that the clearance provisions for the separation distances are providing a cumbersome and time-consuming issues related to actually getting group homes installed in the community. It really does seem to be a regulatory obstacle for a barrier for actually having bids and being able to satisfy conditions of purchase and sale for group homes as well. We received, just on to give a bit of context as well, less than 10 requests for group home type 1 applications per year related to separation distances. So with that, as I mentioned, we are recommending the removal of the separation distances for type 1. We don't think that these are going to have adverse impacts on the community related to negative issues for nuisances or anything of that matter. They are having adverse impacts, though, on the group home operators, and that's one of the main reasons why we're here tonight. And then finally, for that middle bullet, it's been sort of a consensus that's developed amongst our area and also other municipalities that there really isn't a strong land use planning rationale and justification for these separation distances and no standards that are associated with them. So that's another reason we're here. So with that, you can see the recommendation that's before you to amend the zoning bylaw for removal of minimum separation distances for group home type 1s from the 250 meters to 0, and then the direction to initiate the policy and regulatory review. We do think that these changes will help community agencies in developing group homes for people with development disabilities, and it also implements the changes in the London Plan. Thank you.
Any technical questions, Councillor Turner?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Yeoman. Just a really quick question with respect to type 1 and type 2 group homes. Obviously, I appreciate the exposure that we have with type 1 group homes. Why does that same exposure not exist with type 2?
Through the chair, just for some clarification, what do you mean by exposure? Oh, you mean the legal exposure? We haven't received actually any legal concerns that have been raised externally related to group home type 2s, and that's why we're not before you with that tonight. As I mentioned, this is something we would review as part of that review of all group homes in general, though.
Any further technical questions? Seeing none, we can go to members of the public. If you'd like to speak on this item, if you could come to the microphone and state your name and address, please. Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Aileen Watt, address 1786 Marconi Boulevard. I'm here tonight as the manager of accommodation services with Community Living London. Community Living London, in collaboration with families and the community, is a registered charity dedicated to supporting people with developmental disabilities to live inclusive, fulfilled lives. I'm here today in support of the proposed amendment to remove the minimum separation distance from the zoning bylaw for type 1 group homes. By amending this bylaw, people with disabilities will have the opportunity to choose where they want to live, as you and I do. The right to choose where you live is protected within the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's interesting to me this evening, the talk of the last agenda item with the choices of students and housing for students and where they can live throughout our city. In March 2012, after the St. Patrick's Day riot that occurred on Fleming Drive in London, the president of Fanshawe College suggested the student enclave be broken up to reduce the concentration of young people. In effect, introduce a zoning bylaw for student housing. Michael Fox, professor of geography and environment at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick and a graduate of Western University, remarked on this suggestion by stating the following: removing one class of people from a particular neighborhood is simply a form of segregation, counter to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. He also went on to state if any other name was inserted in place of students, it wouldn't be acceptable. No, it wouldn't be acceptable. Yet the City of London has maintained this discriminatory bylaw for people with disabilities. In 2013, the City of Toronto commissioned a report by Dr. Agrawal a land use planning expert with knowledge of the interaction between planning and human rights issues. His report concluded that the definitions and minimal distance separations applicable to group homes were not supportable on land use planning and human rights grounds, and recommended to the Toronto City their removal. Toronto then directed its own staff to review the matter further in consultation with provincial ministry representatives, and the city staff came to the same conclusion. There is no land use planning justification to include a minimal distance separation for group homes in a zoning bylaw. Ultimately, Toronto's council agreed with the experts and voluntarily removed the zoning restrictions. The City of Toronto's decision to voluntarily remove these provisions resolved the legal dispute they faced, but not before the city and its taxpayers incurred significant research and legal costs. Community Living London has continued to advocate for the amendment of this bylaw and has provided city staff with information related to actions taken by Toronto's council, as well as examples of similar discriminatory bylaws in other municipalities. Sarnia, Kitchener, and Smith Falls followed Toronto and removed their discriminatory bylaw criteria for homes operated like the homes that Community Living London operates. And that information was provided to city staff over 4 years ago. Yet London continues to enforce this discriminatory bylaw. Community Living London works with private investors to secure homes to then rent to people who receive supports and services. On average, each successful purchase has taken a year to secure. And our experience has been that it has taken 5 offers on average before a successful purchase is made. This means that people are not able to live where they wish. In a search for a new home, we can all relate to the fact that it takes many viewings to find the home that is perfect for you. Once you make that decision and you place an offer, the excitement grows. Our investors must make a conditional offer upon zoning request and then wait for the city to respond with zoning approval, allowing people with a disability to live in that neighborhood. These zoning requests have taken up to 51 days to receive a response. The home is lost to other offers that do not have such conditions, and in today's housing market, the home is lost in 48 hours. Community Living London has a long, respectful relationship with the City of London over many years. Community Living London has an obligation to the people it supports and their families to ensure that they are treated fairly and that they do not face continuing discriminatory treatment by the city in which they live. It is important not to confuse government-regulated group homes to unregulated, privately operated homes that have been in the media reporting devastating stories of a lack of support and safety to vulnerable people. All of Community Living London's group homes are inspected by employees of the provincial government who require us to maintain our homes, provide adequate supervision to meet the needs of the people who live there, to have fire safety plans and inspections by the London Fire Department, to meet provincial health and safety standards, and to immediately comply with any orders. Our direct support professionals are qualified and trained. They focus on positive neighbor relations and assist the people we support to form lifelong relationships within their neighborhood community. In the rare circumstance that a neighbor puts forward a concern, Community Living London is immediately responsive to rectify the concern and continue to build positive relations in an inclusive neighborhood. We trust that this committee will recommend to City Council to make the right decision, the only legal decision, to abolish this discriminatory practice which negatively impacts people with a disability from having the same right to choose where they live as all other citizens.
Thank you. Looking for further speakers? You'd come down to the microphone and state your name and address.
Yes, good evening. Sorry, I didn't know it was on. My name is Chris Butler. I live at 863 Waterloo Street in the Bishop Helmuth Range. And I have a few questions. I'm a little disappointed Lou is not here at the meeting today, but I trust she can field some of the questions I have. Please respect the fact that I've been asking for the planning report, and nobody would come and make a public comment or submit a public comment without the planning document. The planning document was apparently released last Wednesday, and I got it from Lou Thursday morning. That gave me exactly 1 business day to look at the document and submit something to you. So please, Chair Park, if you could, be a little patient with my questions, okay?
Just so you know, sir, we'll get your questions answered after all the other speakers are through.
This is part of what I'm going to speak about, is questions.
Sure, so you're free to ask your questions. You'll get your answers once all the other speakers are done.
Are there any other speakers now? There didn't appear to be. That's why I got up. I didn't want to.
You have the floor now to ask your questions, please.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I misunderstood you. The first of all is some clarity, really. If this amendment passes, this is a group home one. What, if anything, prevents some concentration of group homes on the same street or the same block? I'd just like an answer for that, please.
Sir, as I said, ask your questions now, and then you'll get the answer at the end.
Okay. The other is, what, if any, metrics have been collected on the existing group home operators? I understand there's advocates at this meeting, but the actual operators that suggests that basically they're a good fit for an R1, R2 residential neighborhood without the setback. That would include interviews with existing neighbors, police metrics, and traffic stuff, which Lou accommodates in his planning document. I saw that yesterday, and I'll talk to that in a second as well. And the third or fourth question that I have is, why has there been no public input on this particular document all through the process? Lou and I both agreed on 2 things. We disagreed on a lot of things when he did call me July 19th. He wouldn't release the document to. But the 2 things that we agreed on were that there has been no public input on this particular bylaw amendment. And that was a bit of concern to both myself and Lou, to be honest. And the second one was that, how does this fit into the overall plan for London? Because I see no budget for group homes in the London budget. I've looked for it. I don't see it in the London strategy. If I missed it in the London plan, the London plan's a bit vague for most citizens like me. So I'd like the whole thing at once, is basically what I'm saying. Rather than get way down in the weeds, look at this bylaw. I'd like to see the whole picture, and I think that most Londoners would be up to the challenge of saying, how do we deal with these legal issues? How do we work things through? But would also be able to provide an amazing amount of input as if we had public input, but we don't. And I'd like to make sure that we underline that fact at this council meeting. The third question I have, and it's a little concerning, it's not quite as nice as the slide was up, is on page 3 of the actual planning document. If you want to bring it to the screen, that's fine, but it's a bit concerning to me as a citizen. Is it says, through this application review, staff may also consider changes to the definitions of group home type 1 and to the overall use as well. And my question is, would there be no public input for that process as well? Because to me, that's just a blank check. If you insert that in this bylaw amendment, it leaves an open step for city staff to just move on like this one and not allow any public input for the amendments that come up, other than potentially for special interest groups. And I think that that's an opportunity for, well, the same thing as here. We've had no public input. It really concerns me. And the last question I have is, I did a fair amount of web research this morning. I only had an hour after I painted. And I don't understand, and I'd like an answer, to how the city distinguishes between a type 1 group home and a business. Because when I look at who's running the group homes, the ones that allow you to look at their sites and that sort of thing, not the ones that advocate for them and set aside, I can only come up with 2 businesses. And these are businesses. They're not group home operators. They're businesses that run. One is international. It's Ango Residential Resources, Inc., and they have a number of sites in town. They're one of the few that doesn't hide their sites on the website. And they're international. They are a business. The name ends with Inc. So, and the other one is Western Area Youth Services, which sounds like it calls itself WAYS. So my question is, how can you distinguish against a business running a type 1 group home and remove the provision that I have as a homeowner that stops or at least allows me a minor variance to respond to a doctor's office, a real estate office, anything like that? And I'm not being discriminatory in that. It's just the way it is. I'm allowed some protection of my R1, R2 rights as a property owner to be able to look at what's coming beside me. And I'm allowed to be able to work with people to get that sorted through. In this case, none of that's happened. We have no public input. So the recommendation I have is that council take a pass on this now, but proceed full speed with not digging in the weeds, but with what the overall plan looks like for London, what's the budget, how does this amendment fit through, and we have real public input on that. Some of that public input will not match some of the information that you've heard from the folks up here in terms of how they feel about this in their neighborhood. They're going to be somewhat apprehensive about it. And I'll give you an example. We had a group home in my neighborhood at 853 Waterloo Street not 3 years ago. And that's before the licensing and all the other stuff happened, because I asked the operator
Butler,
what was going on.
I'll give you about 30 seconds to wrap
Yes,
up. Yep.
very quickly, we had huge traffic problems with this group home. We had people moving in and out. It was 5 bedrooms. There was 8 residents and 1 supervisor. There was always a truck parked on the front lawn with somebody moving in and out. There were guests overnight. So I'm just saying that we also had people put up 7-foot fences in the lots right behind it because we had all kinds of noise, confusion, everything else. So it sort of doesn't match what's being presented here. That was our neighborhood experience. And we worked really hard to try and get this sorted out. So all I'm asking is that we take a pass on this particular recommendation. We reach out to the public and have a true public meeting on this thing and look to that public meeting for quality answers in some of the challenges that we have. That's all I ask. Thanks very much.
Thanks, sir. Looking for further speakers on this? If you could come to the microphone and state your name and address.
Good evening. My name is Brian Simlittle. I live on Chiddington Avenue in Lockwood Park here in London. And by chance, I am also the Director of Finance for Community Living London. I thought I could throw a few facts in here and answer some of the questions that came up to save you the trouble later. Community Living London, as far as I know, most of the other organizations in our sector receive no funding whatsoever from the city. We are independent charities that receive funding from a variety of sources and run our own group homes under the direction of a local board of directors. At this point, I don't know the exact number of group homes in the city, but there are well over 80, and they all fit, shouldn't say all, they fit into they are full of people who live in their community, shop in their communities, drop over to their neighborhoods, to their neighbors for a drink. And as far as I know, the last time I moved, there was no call for public input into where I could live and to which neighbors I was allowed to have and how many people were allowed to live in my house with me. So I'm not sure why these particular people are the target of government regulation. As I said, we receive no funding from the government at all. All of the providers, and I believe there are 8 or 9 in our particular sector in the city, are supervised by the government as a lean mesh and meet a very high standard of inspections every year by the fire department, by the ministry, by the health people, by the Ministry of Labor. If there are better maintained, safer homes in the city, I certainly don't live in one. So if you have other questions, I'd be comments, I'd be happy to address those as well.
Thank you, sir. Looking for other speakers? If you come to the microphone and state your name and address, please.
Hi, my name's Anita Bacon. I live at 52 David Street, London, Ontario, and I'm here tonight representing Christian Horizons, and just want to certainly share that we support and endorse the efforts and comments of Community Living London as a partner agency in the developmental services sector. Christian Horizons is one of the largest developmental services providers in Ontario and nationally as well. And I'd just like to share a few key points tonight. One being that people with a developmental disability should have choice in where they live and with whom they live with, and it should not be limited by zoning. We too have experienced some of the challenges that we heard from our colleagues at Community Living London in the past when wanting to find locations where people that we support can live in this city. Distance restrictions, in essence, discriminate against people based on their disability. Distance restrictions limit the ability of community agencies to leverage shared supports and be cost-effective, and as such, being good stewards of the public purse. The very definition of community is open and welcoming, and this bylaw restriction is counter to that thought. And furthermore, just eliminating the distance bylaw would certainly help to make London a more inclusive, diverse, and welcoming community.
Thank you. Any further speakers? Going once, twice, 3 times. We'll take a motion to close the public participation meeting.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Mr. Yeoman.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll try to do my best to answer some of the questions that are raised. I greatly appreciate everyone's comments tonight on this very important issue. In terms of the report being published and getting that to Mr. Butler, our policy is that we always wait until the official agenda and reports are published before we circulate to anyone to make sure that Council's receiving the information at the same time that the community is. The questions are related regarding concentration of group homes and potential impacts. Our position is by the very nature of the type of group home type 1s, that the users that are involved in the group homes, we're not anticipating that there'd be significant impacts that are greater than a single family home in a neighborhood. If you notice on page 279 of your report, you have the definitions of the 2 types of group homes. We're looking at 3 to 8 people max in this area, so I think that's an important thing to note. In terms of the public consultation, so there was of course notice for this meeting tonight. We will be undertaking further public consultation for that broader policy review. As I mentioned, we felt that this was a fairly streamlined issue to look at in isolation of that broader review, but we definitely will be engaging the public in a broader conversation about group homes. And that then leads into the question about the overall plan. That's something that we're going to be looking at through that policy and regulatory review. We think that's an important conversation for the community to have. In terms of notice, there was a comment made about page 278 of your package related to the public notice that went out that said through this application review, staff may consider changes to definitions and other such matters such as that. That ties to that policy review piece that I mentioned as well. So we just wanted to set up the public for information that we'd be coming back with a recommendation to undertake that review. And then finally, related to group homes versus businesses. So of course, through zoning, what we're looking at is the use, and we're looking at the definition that's in the zone. As I mentioned, for that definition for group home type 1, it speaks to a licensed and supervised building, and it speaks to a certain number of characteristics of the users that are associated with it. So that's what we would look at when determining whether or not they meet the definition for group home type 1.
Thank you, Mr. Yeoman. Looking for speakers, committee. Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So thank you for those who came to present and the correspondence that we received as well. There's one piece in correspondence that kind of described this as a quarterback sneak play, and I have to push back against that right now. I think this is appropriate. I think any time that we are notified that we may be out of compliance with our legal obligations, there's a duty upon this council to act quickly upon that and not delay. So that's what you're seeing here, and I think it's appropriate for us to make that consideration. The broader context of the review is appropriate to have that public input and public consultation. There was public notice given, and as Mr. Yeoman stated, the reports have to come to council first. They can't be shared outward before council has an opportunity, and the difference in time between them being released to council and them being released to the community is hours. So it allows time for those reports to be prepared and presented, and some of them may be prepared well in advance of council meetings. Some may be right up to the agenda deadline. It needs to be able to allow for that time to elapse. So I understand the concerns, but I think our administration worked very diligently to make sure that documents are available to the public for ready review and for consultation on them. So I appreciate that. A question I have through you, Madam Chair, if I might, is a question of how this might align with our limits on the number of bedrooms within residential areas, especially low density residential. Is there an intersection with this? Is an exception to that, or is there a requirement within it?
Mr. Yeoman?
Yes, as Mr. Coffs is reminding me, it has to still comply with the underlying zoning that's involved. That's something we could look at with the policy review just to make sure that there's a connection there, or if there does need to be a connection there.
There we go, now we got it. Thanks, I appreciate that. So ultimately then the building itself would have to be, if it was in an LDR, then it would require low density residential. It would require a max of 5 bedrooms, and that would limit how many occupants could be within that building. Fair enough. My other concern is that I mean, while the complaints and concerns were brought forward with respect to type 1 group homes, we still may be in a situation where we might be offending the same statutes with our type 2. And I'm not sure, as I raised earlier, if this needs to be addressed immediately or if it can wait. I think given that we haven't had any complaints, it's reasonable to say, look, we're doing the review and we're taking all actions to make sure that we comply. We know that this one's a situation where it has created constraints and difficulties within the community, and so forth. We must address it. If that's the approach, then I can appreciate that. If there's a way that we can accelerate on the type 2, I'd be interested in that as well, through you, Madam Chair.
Through you, Madam Chair, we'll definitely make sure we expedite this review as quickly as we can to bring it forward to committee and council. I will note that the current current official plan does speak to having setbacks associated with group homes. So that's one of the reasons why we've just come forward with the type 1. The type 2 group home uses, as you see in the definition, are a bit more intense and a bit more involved. So we think that there's a bit more of a conversation that needs to occur, more review and analysis before we come forward with that.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. So this application, I absolutely support. I think the fact that we do have exclusionary policies just based on a person's abilities or disabilities is well, I was going to say quite potentially, but it is absolutely contrary to the Human Rights Code. And I think we do need to take all actions to make sure that that's rectified. And I think this is a proper course of action. So thank you for bringing it forward, for having it to the community as well, for having it identified it to us. These are things that well, as you may have learned in your familiarity with our official plan, as you read through it, it's a large document, and we have lots of large documents, so it does take the community to help us wade through them and identify and flag issues when they come up, and hopefully we respond appropriately, and I think this is certainly one of those. So I do support the recommendation and happy to move it when it comes forward.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm looking forward to the review coming back. One of my concerns was what are we going to be doing with the type 2? So looking forward for that review, but also with the review coming back, are we going to be looking at the non-legal group homes, or is that, where are we with that?
Through the chair, I don't think I can quite speak to the illegal ones. We'd be dealing with ones that met the definition that's articulated here, which are the licensed and supervised ones. The illegal ones would be an enforcement matter versus a zoning matter.
Thank you for that clarification, and I want to thank the public for coming out and voicing your views and comments, and I really appreciate your advocacy to make sure that we do not discriminate. It is important, and I am in support of this recommendation. I know in my ward, I'm always amazed that we have these group homes. They are part of our community, and as much as these group homes benefit, we as a community benefit by having them in our communities, and I'm very supportive of having them there, and do not see, I'm just really surprised we even have these setbacks in place, quite frankly. I was not aware of that. So supporting the recommendation. And I understand too the difficulty that a lot of these agencies have when purchasing homes in communities with these restrictions and the challenges that they have to meet to purchase these homes and the difficulties that they may not be around. So I'm really pleased that we're going to be removing this, and thank you again for coming out.
Any further speakers? Councillor Cassidy, then Helmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I also will be supporting the staff recommendation on this. I know I have at least one group, type 1 group home in my ward and not far from me, and it's a testimony to how they are embraced, these residents are embraced in their community, and they're a part of their community. When I had a resident call in and say, there's one girl that lives in this home that is in a wheelchair and goes back and forth on the sidewalk, and the sidewalk was torn up in this one spot, and put a call in to staff, and that particular repair was expedited and made happen really quickly, so that this person could have her daily outing. So I thought that was really great to hear from a community member who doesn't even really know the girl, just sees her do this every day. So, and the other thing that we need to be aware of is to make sure when we have these group homes that we have the right infrastructure in place, because I know I have another thing going on in my ward with the ramps at the corners, so that people can cross the streets. And right now the ramp is not, it's not the way it should be. It's a little too high. And so the people in their wheelchairs are having difficulty navigating that street crossing. So we have a list on how we're doing these things, how we're upgrading these ramps throughout the city. And right now I'm working with staff to see if we can move this particular location up on the list, because we know that we have an identified group home in the area, and we know that these people need this infrastructure in place because this is where they live. These are people that are using this every day. And I understand there are people with mobility issues throughout the city, and it's not just people living in group homes. But I just want to ensure that we see going forward that we have the right infrastructure in place when we know we have residents in the area that require that.
Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. It's been a while since we had any correspondence at all about this issue, and I do support the change the zoning bylaw to remove the minimum distance separation. I think it's very reasonable, and I wish we had dealt with it earlier, frankly. A couple of things I want to say. One is this change in the zoning bylaw would really bring our policies as implemented through zoning in line with what we've already passed in the official plan, the new official plan and the London plan. And I think that's important to recognize. The London Plan had lots of public feedback, and the policies that we passed in the London Plan related to group homes said that they will be allowed in all neighborhood place types, with the exception of agricultural areas. So, you know, every neighborhood place type is going to have the ability to have group homes as of right. And I think that's important. How we implement it in zoning, obviously, we're dealing with that now, but we did pass that last year, just a couple months before this time last year. And it was in August 2015 when we heard from the Chief Commissioner of Human Rights in Ontario, who wrote to us to give feedback specifically on the draft London Plan and suggested a number of changes, including the language that we essentially see in the London Plan. And we were recognized to say, I'm glad to see that you're moving away from this minimum distance separation business, and you should, you know, expand it to include 10 residents and not, you know. So we've made some changes, and I think that the zoning recommendation is really just bringing that in line with the London Plan. Now, along with many other things in the London Plan, of course, those policies have been appealed by a number of parties, and we'll have to resolve those appeals before the London Plan comes in force and effect. In the meantime, I think it's very wise of us to get rid of this minimum distance separation now, so that we can take away some of the obstacles that are affecting people accessing this kind of residential housing. And I think that's the big difference between a group home, which certainly can be run as a business, and other kinds of businesses that are not residential. You know, at first and fundamentally, this is some place where somebody lives. And that's why we're dealing with it through the residential zoning. That's why we want to allow them all over the city, because I think we can accommodate this kind of housing in various places throughout the city. And I don't see any reason, no planning reason, no land use reason why we need to have minimum distance separations for this particular kind of use. So I'm looking forward to the review of the other kind, the type 2 group homes. I think we might need to change those policies as well, but I'm glad we're moving forward with this one at this time.
Thank you, councillors. Any other speakers? Councillor Van Holst?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And through you, I'm also happy to support this. I've got a number of these in my ward. I never thought to measure the distance between them, so I wasn't aware we had the separation as well. I'm wondering, in the refining of the regulations and the definitions, will there be ways to address some of the issues that were brought up by the residents in the public participation meeting, or are there other ways to deal with those specific issues?
Through the chair, I don't know if we can fully resolve the issues, but given that this is a public participation meeting, we're receiving these comments, we'll definitely be bringing them forward in the review and looking to see what can be done to perhaps address some of the concerns, perhaps mitigate some of the concerns, if it's believed to be warranted.
Okay, thank you. And it's great that we actually are looking for public input when refining these. Have we looked to some other municipalities for how they're dealing with this? I spoke to a man just last week regarding this issue. He says in York Region they have a different model and thinks it's quite successful, and was hoping to bring some suggestions from there to the public input. But I don't know, have we surveyed some of the other municipalities?
Through the chair, the policy review actually hasn't been begun yet. We do know from, I think there's 4 or 5 other municipalities that have taken the actions that is recommended for committee to take tonight to remove the separation distances. The broader conversation about group homes in general, though, we'll definitely be looking at an issue scan, a municipality scan, to see what other jurisdictions have been doing.
Thank you very much.
Alrighty, thank you, colleagues. And I'm just going to make a couple of comments from the chair. As someone who's worked with individuals of varying degrees and types of disabilities, I share the aghast that I heard that we had these policies in place. And I really think it's a huge step forward in terms of like our own strategic plan where we talk about London being an inclusive and supportive and compassionate community. This is certainly a step that we need to take and as expeditiously as possible. So thank you for all the comments and thank you for the public for coming out, and look forward to the next phase of this.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Alrighty, colleagues, we've dispensed with the other agenda items. Is there any additional business anyone would like to raise? Seeing none, we can take a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Turner, seconded by Councillor Cassidy. All in favor? And thank you for a good meeting, everybody.